Okay, we might get started. So welcome to today's NDARC webinar. My name's Sarah Farnback and I'm a researcher at NDARC. Today we're going to be hearing about the cannabis growing policy landscape, lessons from the ACT, from one of our wonderful friends, Liz Barrett. But before we begin, I'd just like to pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the lands on where we meet, which in my case is the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. So today Liz is going to be talking about the cannabis growing policy in ACT. Liz is a good friend of NDARC's. She works at the Drug Policy Monitoring Program at the Social Policy Research Centre, which is also at UNSW, so we're just across the road from each other. She's conducted a range of research projects on drug regulation, models of decriminalisation, and other policy-related areas, and describes herself as a policy wonk. She has a lot of experience working in research and across policy as well. Afterwards, we're going to be joined by a star panel. We're going to have Dr. Michaela Kowalski and Professor Simon Lenton joining us for a discussion. Michaela is a postdoc research fellow here at NDARC, and she was awarded her PhD earlier this year. Congratulations, Michaela, for her mixed method study on alcohol policy in New South Wales. And many of you will know Professor Simon Lenton. He's the director of the National Drug Research Institute over in sunny Perth, or not so sunny Perth, he tells me today. And he's been doing research on cannabis law reform for over 30 years and has co-authored a book Legalising Cannabis with Tom Decourt and Chris Wilkins in 2020. So he brings loads of experience to it as well. So we'd love to have a good discussion with our panelists and our presenter today after Liz has finished speaking. So please put your questions into the Q&A function. Questions are preferred, comments are interesting, but we'll try and get through questions if we can. After the talk, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. I think that's it from me. So I'm going to ask Liz to join us, she's got her camera on, turn on her mic, and everything seems to be working. I'll hand over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. So, cannabis. When you hear that word, what does it make you think of? Is there an image that pops into your head, or do you have a certain memory, or does it make you feel a certain way? And the reason I ask is because what you're thinking of right now is going to be quite different for everyone else at this seminar. And that's because cannabis, the word, the understanding of what it is, the object that you think of and your experiences, your knowledge and understanding of it are all deeply embedded within material, social, cultural, political, and historical contexts. And this is important because how we understand and how we know cannabis, how we are allowed to come to know it, interpret it, and feel about it, shapes our types of responses to it. So if cannabis is only known or configured in certain ways, then our responses to it are likely to be fairly limited. And this idea of cannabis as a drug, and drug objects more broadly being constituted in certain ways, and of limitations with the policy process to understand and challenge the dynamic and complex modes of constitution, and indeed policy's own role in the constitution of drug and drug objects, was a driving concern of the research that we undertook with people who grow cannabis in Canberra that I'm going to be talking to you today about in this seminar. So I'm just going to firstly start with a very brief history of cannabis. Cannabis is an ancient crop. It's been cultivated for thousands of years and is deeply interwoven with human social spatial practices. There's a very long and detailed history across various different countries and cultures. There's a documentation in Emperor Shenlong's Pharmacopoeia back in 2800 BC, indicating its use for medicinal purposes all the way back then. But there's also various records in ancient Hindu, Assyrian, Greek, and Roman texts in its use for hemp materials and also for a range of spiritual and social purposes. However, in the last 100 years, particularly in the West, cannabis has been subject to intense legal prescription. So this starts in 1925, where cannabis is added to a League of Nations transnational drug control treaty. And then, of course, in the 1930s, we see cannabis being recast in the West as a dangerous psychoactive substance associated with reefer madness. Side note, I guess there's a lot of etymology bound up in these processes as well. Cannabis has a variety of different names through different cultures and countries. And the United States purposefully used the term marijuana because of a desire to tie its use to its Mexican name. By association, Mexican immigration and sensational tales of drug-fueled violence. And so there's a pretty great history on the etymology by MacDonald in 2023. In 1961, the United Nations introduced their first international drug control treaties, followed by 2 others. And these are widely interpreted as encouraging member states to have a prohibitionist approach to drugs, including cannabis, and to ban their use, distribution, and possession. Australia is a signatory to all 3 treaties, and following their signing of the first one in 1961, the Commonwealth introduced legislation prohibiting the possession, use, and trafficking and cultivation of cannabis, with all states and territories following suit. This is a poster here from Sydney in 1967 in Sydney, calling for the legalisation of cannabis and protesting those laws. Of course, cannabis was also subject to the war on drugs. I mean, that was a particularly US thing, but it was influential for a variety of different countries' policy settings, including Australia. And that was really encouraging, you know, a police response to drug use. So cracking down on drug use and the use of arrest and incarceration. Of course, in the US and elsewhere with heavily racialized implementation. And so this war on drugs also drove many producers underground, with producers experimenting with indoor methods of cultivation to avoid detection, including experimentation with new technologies and new strains and hybrids, and developing more potent forms of cannabis. At the same time, of course, in the West, we see cannabis deeply embedded in counterculture movements and social movements in music, arts, and we see its expression and constitution as an object of pleasure, and we see different expressions of cannabis through music and arts and music. Cannabis also went on to be one of the world's most widely used illicit drugs, to the point where some argue that it's been normalized in certain communities and certain subcultures. And this includes Australia, where the last household survey from 2022 to 23 confirmed that cannabis is still the most commonly used illicit drug here, with 42% of the adult population having used it at least once in their lifetime. And just to point out, that last image there is from Nimbin, from the Mardi Gras, and that is outside the hemp embassy. So in the past 20 years, particularly, there's been a pushback against these kind of prohibitionist approaches for cannabis. There's a kind of growing idea internationally, or feeling internationally, that problematic drug use is best dealt with through health responses, and an argument as well that the legislation and the prohibition of cannabis is not kind of on a par with the dangerousness or the harms associated with cannabis. There was an introduction of medical cannabis and the creation of legal medicinal products from about 2010 onwards, and that includes in Australia at the end of the 2010s. And so now in Australia, you can go to your GP and you can legally access cannabis if you get a prescription. And so that's led to a proliferation of new types of medicinal cannabis products, as you can see on the screen. And now we've got many parts of the world also looking to reform their cannabis legislation for recreational use. So there's a number of countries who've removed criminal penalties for consumption and possession, and even the creation of legal markets. For instance, in parts of the US and Canada now, you can actually go into stores and buy cannabis legally over the counter. And again, this has led to a new proliferation of products that you can see on the screen that include new like gummies and lollies and edibles, and new low and high THC products. So cannabis is thus also a marketized commodity in a multi-billion-dollar legal industry, sometimes termed big cannabis. So these divergent histories and representations demonstrate just how difficult it is to see and treat cannabis as one particular definitive object. And that is why we can all look at this leaf and have very different understandings of what it is and the type of object it is and how we might respond to it. So of course, there's been an interrogation of the constitution of drug objects and cannabis objects also by scholars drawing on a range of STS, feminist anthropology, and post-structuralist theories, who note that what cannabis and other drug objects are not fixed and given, but rather emergent and contingent, constituted through a complex networks of relations, discourses, and socio-material practices. So hopefully my very brief potted history of cannabis demonstrates that the way that cannabis has been named and made and remade throughout history in particular ways and within legislation and culture, and how different ontological renderings have seen different objects of cannabis emerge and be reproduced through and legitimized even through law and policy. However, this figuring of cannabis as a drug and more recently as a medicine has displaced other potential ontologies, including the configuration of cannabis as a plant. And that is together with planty associations of more than human liveliness and aesthetic depth and effective relations. So looking at these new regulatory systems of cannabis and paying closer attention to the social and material networks in which cannabis objects are produced can provide unique insights into the legal, social, and political controversies that often attend the cultivation, distribution, and consumption of the drug. And home cultivation is one of these areas that's seen a proliferation of policies, each reflective of the differences of each country and jurisdiction, but all grappling with how best to regulate cannabis as a drug through environmental and biological limitations on the plant. And that is really how we found ourselves in Canberra, where new legislation came into the force at the beginning of 2020 that legally allowed people to possess, use, and grow cannabis. And so we were interested to understand how cannabis was constituted by policymakers and how the new regulation was being experienced and navigated by people who use and grow cannabis. So I'm just going to try and really quickly run through the laws and some of our methods and findings before talking about findings from our fieldwork more broadly. So these new laws that came in at the beginning of 2020, I should note, was not legalization. It is still illegal in Canberra to buy and sell cannabis or to distribute products in any way. That includes sharing and swapping. And there's boundaries around how you can do these activities. So you can legally possess up to 50 grams of dried cannabis and 150 grams of wet or freshly harvested cannabis. You can grow up to 2 plants per person to a maximum of 4 per household. And interestingly, and I'll talk about this next, artificial cultivation is banned. And that was described in legislation as to hydroponically cultivate or to cultivate with the application of an artificial source of light or heat. And I will side note here that the participants in our study readily interpreted that to be a ban on indoor growing because people in Canberra do have electricity in their houses and heating. Some other things just to quickly note about the law: you couldn't have plants accessible to the public. They must be grown where you live, so you can't give them to someone else to grow. And it's worth noting that there's no access to seeds. That wasn't a particular part of the legislation, but is a complicated factor of being a territory and working in a federated system where the Commonwealth still have jurisdiction over seeds. So we were quite interested in understanding why the laws were configured the way they were. And so we went and looked at the debates that happened in Canberra. So we looked at Hansard and we looked at the documents that came out along with the legislation. And what emerged really was a dialogue of attempting to control cannabis, the drug, and this configuration of the plant was pretty much absent from discussions, apart from in a few references here and there. What we also found was, and this was predominantly an argument executed by the police, was that artificial cultivation was argued to be something that you would only do to produce really strong THC plants. So THC being one of the chemicals that produces the high when you use cannabis, really high yields of the plant, connected to criminality and criminal gangs, bikies, and is something that people do to be able to traffic drugs. These ideas and configurations of hydroponic cannabis in particular kind of reproduced constructions from elsewhere that have focused on hydroponic cannabis as being less healthy because it's not natural and with an association with organized crime. I'm saying that I'm not actually aware of any other country that has liberalized cultivation laws, banned hydroponic or other forms of artificial cultivation. If you are aware, please throw that information into the chat. And in fact, there are some jurisdictions internationally that require cultivation to be in an enclosed or non-visible space. And so again, I guess this raises interesting questions of how cannabis is being conceptualized and how harms are being constituted in these processes. And just finally, you know, this idea of natural and versus artificial isn't a simple biological distinction, but in Western discourses is commonly associated natural is commonly associated with virtue, morality, and goodness, and on the other side, artificial acts as a proxy for behaviours and practices that are deviant. So, in terms of our fieldwork, excuse me. We undertook 2 studies. So our initial study was a year after the legislation had come into place. It's COVID times, so we conducted 30 semi-structured interviews, but predominantly over phone or over Zoom, but predominantly again with cameras turned off. And that was really just to gain an experience of the new laws and understanding of practices that were emerging from the new legislation. We'll say that was a really diverse cohort, diverse in terms of ages, histories of use, and in terms of socioeconomic status. And what we found emerging from that particular study was this really interesting tension, in particular of growers trying to adhere to the law and particular material practices emerging from the attempts at that kind of adherence. So we decided to go back the next year, focusing only on people who grow cannabis. And so we undertook photo elicitation interviews, and this was kind of post-COVID-ish, so we were able to undertake some of these in person. So 5 of these interviews were in person and 4 in people's homes, and that meant that we were able to see growing spaces, and in one case actually meet a plant that was still alive. And in those interviews, we asked people, we asked people to bring photos along to the interviews. And we gave suggestions of the types of photos they might like to bring. But as it turned out, people had been documenting their kind of growing journey over the year or multiple years, and so came armed with these photo albums, which was very cool. And the purpose of that second study was really understanding the particular situated and material realities of cannabis cultivation and what lessons that may have for contemporary drug policy processes. So I'm just going to run through some headline findings, and these won't be a surprise for anyone who is familiar with the international research on with cannabis growers, particularly the Global Cannabis Consortium survey. And that is that there were multiple reasons for people to grow, predominantly for self-supply. And I've split medicinal and recreational up there, but in reality, that's very, very blurred. Just that there were some people whose main purpose was to grow to supply the compassionate medicinal market. Joy, satisfaction, experimentation, intrigue were also significant drivers. And it's worth noting that in that second study, there were 3 people who'd started growing to supply themselves, had stopped using cannabis, but had continued to grow the plant just because they found it such a wonderful, interesting, and intriguing species to grow. There was one person we spoke to over that 40 interviews who grew for profit to sell the cannabis that they grew. And that was the only person across those 40 interviews who didn't like this legislation because they saw it as a threat to their business model. But everyone else wholly thought that this legislation was very beneficial and was a very good thing to have happened. And lots of benefits for people being able to self-supply, especially, you know, access to cheap and plentiful cannabis, but avoiding dodgy dealers. Plant growth hormone was also an issue that came up quite a bit in our interviews with people in Canberra, particularly associated with street weed, bikie weed, and was something that was reported to not be very good quality and make people feel unwell and give them headaches. So I'm just going to delve into a bit more depth about some of the kind of themes that emerged. And particularly this idea of natural and artificial was really contested amongst our participants. I mean, from the get-go, if you're a gardener, I mean, the very definition of it is that you're a person interfering with nature to try and grow plants. And so gardening really is a transgression of natural. And there were these kind of deep conversations with people who were trying to have like so-called natural practices, but really, what does that mean? Here's a quote from one of our participants, Adam, who would regularly go outside and turn his plants around so they each got an equal side of the sun. And then he thought about it before the second harvest and thought, well, that's not really how nature works. So in nature, plants grow best sitting in the ground and the sun grows over them. So I mean, that's a nice example of someone kind of having a philosophical discussion about what is nature, what is natural. But at the same time, you get this really kind of tender story of someone going outside and caring so much about their plants. And these kind of tender relational moments of practice and care emerged from heaps of our participants that we spoke to. So we had another person who spoke about waddling their plants through their apartment so that they could catch, quote unquote, natural rain when it rained. And another participant who said that their approach to gardening was very scientific, but would get up early every single morning to wiggle their plants and knock the dew off and prevent mold. And in actual fact, what we found were plants were regularly moving between artificial and non-artificial environments, and particularly in those early months when they were seedlings. And that's because, as you're all probably aware here, that the ACT climate can be a bit tough if you're a gardener. In winter, it can be very cold and frosty. And so people were planting their seeds in like kind of July, August time when there is the potential for frost. And in summer, it can be very, very hot. And we were speaking to people kind of at the tail end of La Nina. For those not on the eastern seaboard of Australia at that time, La Nina, came with lots and lots of tropical rain for 2 years, almost non-stop. And so that was an issue for people who were growing outside. So what we found were heat lamps were actually quite common for our participants, and particularly in those kind of early months in order to protect their plants from frost, but also to give their seedlings the best possible start they could. Worth noting here as well that the expensive seeds was a motivation. Remember, I said they were illegal. So some people were purchasing them illegally overseas in the legal markets and having them shipped over, but they cost quite a bit. And it took time to get here. So there was extra motivation to make sure that those seeds really did work, because they didn't want to spend more money and they didn't want to wait around waiting for new seeds to arrive. But really, there were a range of interventions that people used to protect their plants from bad environmental conditions or to expose their plants to the best natural conditions that they could. So I'm just going to give you the case study of one of our participants. I'll call Grant. So Grant did actually purchase UV lights from eBay for his cannabis plants. Although I will note that, Grant described that once he'd set the lights up, lots of other plants ended up being there. It wasn't just cannabis. So he threw in tomato plants and capsicum plants and the rest. And then once those plants got a little bit bigger, he moved them out to a sunroom in his house, which was full of natural light. And the plants stayed there until the weather was good enough for them to go outside, or they'd just kind of grown too big and cumbersome, or his children came to him and said, Dad, the plants stink. And then he knew to get them in the garden. However, as described by Grant, the garden bed just wasn't a normal garden bed. He specially constructed it in the middle of the yard. As Grant says, who does that? But this was all about optimizing the garden bed for sunlight with cannabis in mind. And this was a house that we visited, and he did literally dig up his lawn to put in this kind of this bed at a jaunty angle. And again, that bed, while cannabis plants were planted there, so were tomato plants and so on. And so I guess in this example, you can see that there's multiple modes of the use of space and manipulation of light and heat. But it was only one of these that was illegal, and that was only for the cannabis plant. So it was only illegal for the cannabis plant to be under that heat lamp, not for the others. And so this, I guess, highlights the complexities of this artificial and natural binary drawn upon in legislation, and just how differently cannabis was being treated in that legislation compared to other plants and other plant matter. Oh, I don't think I've got time to talk about this, only to note that stigma was a consideration from some of our participants who noted that there was still a certain section of the population who saw cannabis use as deviant, and they didn't want people to find out that they were growing cannabis. So there were lots of stories of people literally throwing their cannabis plants over a balcony when certain people came to visit. We only spoke to one person who grew hydroponically during those 2 lots of interviews. So just for clarification, hydroponics is where you grow your plant in a solution rather than soil, like a nutrient-rich solution. And fear of the neighbours finding out was a primary reason for that person to use hydroponics. So as this quote shows you, they've got, a doctor, elderly couple, nurses and kids as neighbours, and they couldn't stand the thought of them knowing. So although they had a garden bed, they opted to put up a discreet grow tent at the back of their garage instead, to grow their cannabis. The next point I want to talk about is the joy and the challenges of growing very large cannabis plants, and how wildly cannabis can grow. So it is worth noticing that when people provided the right environment for plants to grow well, they grew really well. And so these are some photos that were shared by participants. As you can see, massive. And some of the stories that emerged in concert with these images were of growers kind of trying to discreetly grow their plants, but the plants quickly, exceeding fence lines and then putting up privacy shields, and then the plants growing again beyond that. So that's that photo on the right, and becoming this like hugely visible plant. And in the gardening world, growing abundant, healthy plants is generally the name of the game, right? It's why you have the country fair, big pumpkin competition and whatever. It's like, it's a thing that people want to do. They want to grow big plants and have great produce. But this is a problem for people growing cannabis, and that's because of cannabis occupying this dual or multi-object kind of place of being a plant and a drug, and particularly the threshold quantities, so the caps on how much people could possess. So people could only possess 150 grams of wet or freshly harvested cannabis. However, for the harvesting of cannabis, cannabis isn't a perennial, and once it's ready, people chop it down. And actually our growers were really specific about the timing of when you chop that plant down, and had special kind of like glasses and things to look at the crystals and the development of their cannabis bud, because it does affect the THC and CBD content depending on how long you leave it on there for. But of course, if you've got a plant like this and you chop it down, it's going to be bigger than 150 grams. And so potentially they were on the hook for trafficking. So, I mean, I guess this is demonstrative really of the difficulties of regulating the natural world, because plants simply don't know that you've regulated against them. They are going to do what they need to do to survive and thrive. But there were practical issues as well, because people couldn't share or swap their produce. If they wanted to stay in under that 150 grams limit, I mean, it was almost impossible. As this participant said, what if you've had a bumper crop, what do I do with it? Do I take it to a green bin? Do I put it in my garbage? I don't know. So there were real issues for people in terms of trying to adhere to the law in these situations. At the same time, this kind of wild, exuberant cannabis was a real joy and a side of joy for a lot of our participants. And fundamentally, there was this charisma that was expressed through the photos and through the stories of cannabis being appreciated and loved, particularly because of this price too muchness and because of these radical transgressions. And in many interviews, cannabis emerged as a delight, not so much in spite of its unruly nature, but because of it. And so this photo here is from another participant, and this is the quote that accompanies this photo, where they talk about this picture just being one of pure joy. And it's pure joy because this is representative of spontaneous growing. This plant came from a friend sitting on the patio, rolling a joint, and seeds just dropping through the deck, and the plant just exploding. And I think I should point out as well, for many of the growers in our photo elicitation study, many of them had not actually grown cannabis before. And actually the growers in our first study that we did over the phone, a lot of the growers that we spoke to anyway, they were into their first or second season of growing, and they'd grown specifically because they were allowed to now under the new legislation. And so for many people, this was actually their first time meeting a cannabis plant, because previously it had been hidden and illegal. And so this wild exuberance of this plant was something that was just fascinating for people and was viewed as a thrill. And people really appreciated this agency of plants. Don't know that I have time to that, so I might just flick through. It's just to note that quickly, really, there was a real desire for people who were growing cannabis for community, and that was expressed in a variety of ways. It was about getting a specific kind of help and advice with their cannabis plants that was specific to Australia. A lot of the advice that was online was from the Northern Hemisphere. There was a real desire to be able to share their joy and their knowledge with other people. Again, a lot of people were kind of fairly isolated. They didn't consider themselves to be part of kind of cannabis cultures or communities. And so they kind of had this hobby that they loved, but they were doing it secretly and didn't have anyone to share that joy with. But again, a practical consideration, harvesting plants, particularly those big ones we saw in that photo, is actually quite labor intensive. There's a lot of preparation that needs to be done. People cut off the leaves. You can get special snips to kind of assist, but it's like fine motor skills if you're kind of cutting all those leaves off, and particularly for people who are unwell, ME, MS, those kinds of conditions, they actually found that quite painful and difficult. And they were concerned for themselves as they got older and unwell, how they would be able to process their harvests. And so there was kind of an expression of, need for community, for assistance and help. So findings for cannabis regulation. It's first off, homegrown cannabis offers policymakers an alternative to the status quo, but also an alternative to commercial cannabis supply like you see in the United States or parts of the United States and Canada. There are a range of benefits for people who use cannabis to be able to self-supply, including avoiding dodgy dealers and avoiding things like plant growth hormone. The notions of artificial cultivation relied on for the legislation pretty arbitrary. The interventions that our participants used were really guided by environmental conditions, perceived plant needs, gardening philosophy, access to space as well. So not everyone had access to a garden bed, stigma and social relations. And so although, again, I should reiterate, the participants broadly thought that this legislation was very positive, when thinking about the specifics of legislation, policymakers might want to take into consideration things like threshold quantities and where they apply, whether they should apply to people at their own home where they're growing plants, and that should be the same as if you're walking around in the world. Plant numbers as well is a consideration, but also really making sure that there is access to seeds and seed banks. Kind of crazy that you can grow a plant. One of our participants said, I can have a plant, but not a seed. When does a seed become a plant? So making sure that people have access to seeds, and along with that, kind of a lot of knowledge about the types of varieties that they're growing and the impacts that that plant may have on them. And again, community. So this idea of needing a community or searching for community. So there are community models overseas. And so our findings suggest that exploring communal models of growing potentially could be beneficial for people in Australia. At the same time, there was obviously this whole other side to our findings of care and relational motivations of a very charismatic being that at present is completely absent from the policy discussions that we're having. And I hope that some of the stories that I told demonstrate, the plant of cannabis is occupying more than a simple drug object position in people's lives. It was just much more complex than that in the stories that we heard. And we found that the way that cannabis was configured by policymakers in the ACT debates and in documents is being really limiting. So this whole world of cannabis as this charming and rambunctious species was wholly absent. So I'm going to quote a new materialist, Van der Veen, here. While there may be a tendency to view plants as passive objects, there are a complex web of entanglements when plants and people interact, creating dynamic relationships in which plants act as agents alongside the varying materialities and networks that exist. So providing the means through which to acknowledge these entangled relations and materialities, I would argue, is especially important for areas like drug policy, where, as I noted at the start, etymology, history, culture, and values has long shaped people's perceptions, their understandings, the narratives of cannabis, and limited the scope of what is deemed acceptable or even possible in terms of a policy response in certain countries. I would also argue that how a being appears in policy is shaped by the way it is known and the kinds of stories that are told. So when beings are not known or understood, or when they're only known in these very limited ways, there is a potential for them to be misrepresented and even denigrated or stigmatized, as noted by Rita, Lancaster, and Prose. So we found that the method of visual storytelling allowed these complex meshwork stories and relationships to unfold. As noted by Harris, storytelling makes the symbolic visceral, creating a material experience. In many ways, stories connect the out there to the here and now, while at the same time inspiring the critical capacity necessary for policymakers to imagine a here and a now, and a then and a there. There are actually clear examples of storytelling and other creative arts processes being integrated into legislative processes, for instance, in reparation and truth-telling processes in Australia and South Africa. And those processes, stories are central to those processes, and it's the power of stories that is relied on to kind of right historic wrongs, to give voice to people and to make governments accountable for atrocities even, and for their impacts. So we would argue that storying and potentially other methods of creative arts processes have a potential role in drug policy processes. As a method, storying can disrupt dominant narratives, especially where they're built on ignorance or prejudice, and give voice to the voiceless, including voices of multi-species subjects like cannabis, that are frequently absent from discourse due to the centering of human agency and values in Western democratic political traditions. So I'm just going to leave you with this quote from Van Doren, Kirksey, and Munster. Contesting for better worlds requires learning to take others seriously in their otherness, finding modes of muddling through that eschew the fantasy of universal translation or a single criterion. So I'm going to leave my presentation there. I just want to acknowledge just the team of people that I was so fortunate to work with on this project, and who were so patient with me and taught me so much. So thank you to Matthew Kearns, Laura McLaughlin, Alison Ritter, Carrie Lancaster, and Richard Meller. We have 2 papers in the works that are currently under review. I'm not on the social medias, but if you follow DPMP on Twitter or drop me an email, I'd be happy to keep you up to date when and if those papers become available. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. That was so interesting. I've made a bunch of notes here. There was a lot in there to unpack. I really loved I love being able to see the photos that really brought it all to life. Thank you. Okay, I won't take up time. So I'd like to ask Simon and Michaela to please turn on your cameras and welcome you to the webinar. Hi, Simon. Hi, Michaela.
Howdy.
So maybe I'll just ask, perhaps we'll start with you, Michaela. Did you want to provide just a quick, start with Simon? Okay, Simon, maybe I'll start with Simon. Did you want to provide a quick, just any reflections or any thoughts that came up initially for you just hearing Liz talk?
Yeah, what a fantastic presentation and piece of research, and it's so great to be seeing this stuff coming out of our only legal cannabis jurisdiction in Australia. And this is quite correct, there's not a legal cannabis market, but it certainly is the case that possession and consumption and cultivation is legal, which I think is super important in the Australian context. And just thinking back to when the bill was being proposed and submissions that many of us and probably many people online put in, I think one of the unfortunate things about the legislation in Canberra, and clearly lots of people see it as a significant step forward, and clearly it is, but one of the unfortunate things I think was the definition that was proposed for artificial cultivation. Where we know that what happened with the way hydroponics was viewed, at least at the time when we were looking at the cannabis infringement notice scheme, bringing that in Western Australia, was that there was a lot of concern, understandable concern, about high potency cannabis and psychosis, and a lot of concern that the sort of hydroponics equals high potency. Therefore, what we need to do is to ban hydroponic cultivation. And so WA, we did that in WA, and I think it was picked up subsequently in South Australia, and I might have that around the wrong way. But of course, the issue isn't so much how cannabis is grown, it's about strain in terms of potency, and it's also about freshness. And I guess that, the yield is greater with hydroponics, and the freshness is greater if you're growing it at home and then being able to dry it and smoke it. And that was kind of conflated in a lot of these discussions about the law. And it would have been, even if the legislators in Canberra would have liked to have banned hydroponic cultivation, and they should have talked about banning cultivation in a non-soil medium, because in our studies internationally, in what is it now, Michaela, 18 countries with cannabis growers, we found that 58% of people were growing in soil under light, and that's something that Liz talked about here. So it's unfortunate that that happened. But let me be quiet now and let Michaela and others say some stuff.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I also find the hydroponic bit quite interesting, and I think it touches on, Liz, you were talking about, the joy of growing and people being really proud of how big they could get their plants, but also that conflicting with part of the regulations that govern it. And it made me think about the fact that police seem to have been consulted quite heavily on drafting these laws, but horticulturalists, for example, if I'm correct, were not at any point. And that's something that we see worldwide, that like horticulturalists are not part of this conversation. I'm not a horticulturist. I kill many a plant, as many people at NDARC know. But I think that when it comes to governing something like a plant, there is scope to involve that part of industry as well, to kind of figure out what should happen. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting and really happy that you did this research.
Thanks. Okay, so we've got a few questions, but I also just want to give you guys some chance to talk, because I know that we had some interesting discussion before we came online. So we'll try and get through a few questions first. I'm actually going to start at the bottom, just picking up on your point there, Michaela. We've just had a question from Paul. So Liz, he's asking about the participants in the study. Did anyone who you interviewed come up with stories about rubbing up against the police or with the law, and were they questioned about their practices at all? Did that come up, those sorts of experiences?
The very first study that we did, that was a year after the legislation came in, some of the participants we spoke to, maybe there were like 3 or 4 who identified as homeless or being known to the police, continue to kind of have a perception of being really, really wary of police. And in one instance, there was someone who reported having their cannabis confiscated. Bearing in mind, this is the really early days of the legislation. And so there may have been a bit of a transition. We may have caught people in a bit of a transition period. Does that answer the question? Otherwise, no. I mean, I should say that the second group of people we spoke to, much less diverse, predominantly all public servants, ex-public servants, or lived with public servants, whereas the first cohort in the 30 phone interviews was very, very diverse. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to jump to a question here. They said, this person said, so interesting. Love hearing about the joy of use. Wondering if you could give us a snapshot and maybe the demographics of the sample, just to provide a bit more context around who you talked to. And also, were there any other discussions about people experiencing any harms from use?
So the sample, so it wasn't a purposeful sample, I should say. We didn't purposefully collect people's demographic information at the start of interviews. We didn't, because of privacy reasons, we didn't want to collect that information. So the information that we had about people's occupation or where they lived, or their living situation, emerged through the interviews. So that's kind of, and sometimes in terms of where people were recruited. So for instance, I put up posters at universities, ANU, Canberra. So people said they got a tear away from university. It was, readily assumed that it was because they were at the university. So we didn't have purposeful sampling. Sorry, what was the other part of that question, Sarah?
Was there anyone who reported any harms experience from using cannabis?
Yeah, there were, but it was very peripheral to kind of the overall consideration. And that came out really through the first interviews. There were people, but there were 1 or 2 people who spoke about previously having used cannabis and having stopped because of particular side effects or use issues that they were having with cannabis. That was something that happened, yeah, but not in the second lot of interviews amongst the growers.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so this next question, I'm just going to throw it out to the floor. It's a little bit about how this stuff is sort of regulated and policed, I guess, again. So this person's asking, if you're flying interstate with a prescription vape pen, so this is like you described, Liz, if you've gone to your GP and you've got your prescription, but you don't have the packaging, is this a problem? Will you need to be able to provide that retrospectively? And what about if you could provide the prescription as evidence on your phone or in paper copy? Does anyone have any thoughts on those sorts of scenarios?
Got no idea, I'm sorry.
I'm not a lawyer, but I would imagine if you wanted to look after yourself, then if you've got medicine with you, even if you're traveling interstate, because it's cannabis medicine, having your script is probably helpful. How will police deal with that? I'm not sure. It'll depend on which jurisdiction you're in and so on. So I don't think anyone can give you a definitive answer on that one.
Yeah, no worries. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, things are jumping around. So, Liz, just back to your own research. Fiona's asking, do you know any data on the percentage of ACT cannabis users who grow their own, or those sorts of, you know, proportions compared to people who are purchasing it?
Good question. I don't, but there is an evaluation that's been undertaken by the ACT government. And so I'd be really interested to know what that proportion is. Simon, Michaela, you might know from, so Venezuela introduced a legal system for cannabis, 2012, was it? And there's information there. Someone shaking his head. I won't give specific dates. I don't have a brain.
You mean Uruguay?
Oh, sorry, Uruguay. Sorry, Uruguay. Thank you. Yeah, so they introduced a legal system where you could access cannabis either through a chemist, or you could grow your own or be a member of a cannabis social club. And I think you had to choose. Do you know what the proportion, what the breakdown is, Simon or Michaela, in terms of people who were growing their own versus those other methods of access?
I should, but I don't off the top of my head. But I do think that, you know, there are problems with the Uruguay scheme in that people had to register, which give their name to authorities in order to join. So I don't think it's a great model. Fiona Patton might have some more evidence than we do about what's happened in the ACT. But I think it's a super important question, because when we've done work in the past, it's only been a small minority of people that have grown their own cannabis. It's going to be interesting to see whether in the ACT, particularly as the scheme's matured, more people may be growing their own. Really important question. I don't know the answer.
So this is not necessarily the answer. This is just the EMCDDA kind of looked at Uruguay at the registration numbers and what people did upon registration. And most people registered to for pharmacy purchases. So over 24,000 people registered for pharmacy purchases. Then the next group was 8,500 people who registered for home growing. And then just over 2,000 people registered to be part of a social cannabis club. And just noting that Uruguay has a population of 3.5 million people at the time. So those are really small numbers. And as Simon said, you had to register to be part of this scheme, and you had to give a lot of demographic details as well to register. And those are things that seem to be really unpopular with people when we ask them in surveys, like, would you give this information to be part of, be able to, you know, obtain cannabis legally? And they're very reticent. So take from that what you will.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. Sort of got me thinking. In this next question relates to this sort of equity idea. So, in any of the research that any of you have come across, and your study as well, Liz, has this come up? This idea of, you know, some people having access to skills, some people having a big Canberra backyard, but some people been in apartments, and not having the environment where they can actually grow their own, and that sort of, you know, I guess equity justice side of that. Has that come up at all?
That's a really good question. I know that was definitely a concern when the legislation came in. There was an argument that it was inherently unfair to have a ban on artificial growing, because it was, again, interpreted to be a ban on indoor growing. I mean, in that first study, we spoke to a lot of people in a range of different circumstances. But yeah, there were definitely issues for people who are in social housing and rental. If they're having inspections, if you have an NDIS worker who comes around, while the law may state that you're allowed to use it, you know, you don't really know what the impacts are going to be if that person comes round and has an issue with it or decides to kind of talk to other people about it. So I think it is a bit difficult for people in certain living situations. Definitely much easier if you own your own house and you have a backyard. But there were people growing in pots. So yeah, I can't say the equity thing came up so much apart from that kind of you know, tenure issue. Access to skills, yes, but again, that was more just because the information that was out there online was Northern Hemisphere related. And there was a real kind of desire, I guess, for more quote unquote kind of normal access to information. People wanted this to be in the Canberra Growing Guide. People talked about Costa potentially doing a segment on ABC gardening. Do you know what I mean? They were like, it's still this weird thing that it's legal, but we've got to go to these online places for information. Yeah, and that sometimes isn't that good or you know, easy to access. But again, the seeds not being accessible is a huge barrier for people. If you can get them, if you happen to buy bushweed or you know a guy and you get seeds in your weed, then you can grow it. Otherwise, you really do have to buy online, and they are expensive if you're buying from overseas. But maybe Simon and Taylor will have, you know, further opinions on this.
I think the equity issue is super important, and I think that if you're going to have a legal market of sorts, then having a regular source of supply for as many people as possible is important, and that means allowing people to be able to grow at home in whatever that looks like. And so I think that's one of the other reasons why, you know, effectively prohibiting indoor cultivation in the law, at least, is a bad idea. And equity matters are super important from a public health perspective, let alone in terms of individual rights and freedoms.
I'm going to say that this question of equity comes up in a lot of areas of cannabis policy, including cultivation, but just other questions of supply as well. And it's something that some legislators kind of battle with when they're looking at regulating cannabis, and these questions of equity as far as, you know, communities that have predominantly been targeted by cannabis regulations, and kind of looking at how these laws can then be used in equity in there and increasing access. But also there are questions that then emerge about, like, also things to do with cannabis. In New South Wales particularly, for example, you can't really get a caution if you have prior drug offences. So that kind of butts up against equity, because if you come from a community that's been marginalised, you've been targeted and profiled and policed, then you are not able to get the diversions and the kind of, I don't know, forgiveness that we give for other people. So equity is a thing that comes up in a lot of domains in drug policy and cannabis policy, and it's here as well. Sorry,
Yeah, great
derail.
point. Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and it's interesting to think about the broader context, because I know it varies so much state to state. Yeah, interesting. So just thinking about the ACT experience, this is a question to all of you. Paul's asked, is there a sense that this has worked? Like, has this been considered to be successful? I guess from your research, Liz, but also more broadly. And is there any evidence that it has actually reduced harm or had any impact on the black market or anything?
I mean, I'm not sure that the purpose of the legislation was to reduce harms from the black market. But, I mean, look, amongst the participants that we spoke to, like I said, they all thought that this was a really good thing. And I guess, and people did talk to the harms in terms of being able to choose plants for themselves, you know, especially when they bought seeds from overseas, and being able to choose the types of methods that they wanted in a plant. And so some people really did value organic, you know, organic processes for gardening, and was a big concern. There are a couple of people who had quite severe medical issues, and so they were really keen to be able to get cannabis that was grown organically, and they were able to do that by growing it themselves. But like I say, there is an evaluation out, and so I'd be interested, and it's not public, I don't think, yet, unless someone else has a contact or a note and you want to put in the comments. So I'm not sure overall. Simon and Michaela, that idea of access to cannabis and the reduction in harms, do you have a comment on that more broadly, or understanding of how that works in other countries and jurisdictions?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think there's an evaluation going on the ACT scheme. It'll be great to see the results of that in relation to that question, because it's super important. I suspect that given the restricted nature of the ACT scheme, we're not going to see huge impacts in terms of moving away from the black market, because I think self-supply is still a minority behaviour for most people for all the reasons that we've talked about. But yeah, I mean, you know, not having another source of supply that doesn't involve growing your own is super important. But if you really want to undermine the black market, you need to have another source of supply. And the question is, what does that look like? Is it the fully commercial, profit-driven models of most parts of the US and Canada that have legalized cannabis, or is it a more restricted model like we see in Quebec, that has a small number of government-run stores that are supplying the market with money going direct back to government? Really interesting model, and I think we'll see more about that in coming years. Yeah, that's it.
Sorry, Michaela, I mean, I'll just make one more point as well, that I think when we talk about harms as well, we need to consider the full scope of harms in relation to illicit drugs, including the harms from criminalisation. And that is a huge thing to understand and unpack. Being prosecuted by the police, having a criminal record that follows you through life, you know, prevents you from getting drugs, stigmatisation, marginalisation. We know who are the people who are more likely to be impacted by a criminal record are people who are already kind of dealing with lots of different types of disadvantage. And that shouldn't be underestimated. So absolutely, removing the ability for people to be arrested for their use and possession of personal uses of cannabis would 100% have removed those harms, because people are no longer being prosecuted. And I think that we need to consider those harms as well. And they do actually have that themselves have a health impact, not just use. Michaela, did you want to add anything?
Say that harms are broad and bring up what you were talking about, but also that there's things that kind of different legislators look at throughout the times as drug driving, like mental health, comorbidities, and questions about that can kind of come up. And as Simon said, different jurisdictions and different regulations kind of tend to produce different outcomes. So you're not really comparing this. It's not really. You're not really on steady grounding to compare like compare a market that you've got like in the state of Washington in the US, where you've got products that are up to 70% THC in these gummies, and like that's not comparable to the market that Simon was describing in Quebec, and it's not comparable to what they've done in the ACT. So you're not likely to see a lot of kind of dangerous indicators going up. Someone in the chat has posted a review of it, so I think we're all just flicking through that.
Yeah, thank you. We're just about at time. I'm going to sneak in one more question just because we've got a few there, and I know I haven't quite got through all of them, but I'm going to sneak in one more. We were talking about this beforehand, but were there any examples, Liz, from your research of people illegally providing their legally grown cannabis to other people? And was this a problem? And maybe could you just tell us a little bit around the context around that as well?
No, I mean, to be honest, we didn't ask about people supplying other people with drugs. We were, you know, the conversations were fairly kind of limited, and we didn't stray into that. So, I mean, was it happening? I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't tell you. It wasn't an area that we explored. We were more interested in people's personal kind of growing practices. And it wasn't something that emerged through our stories either. Sorry.
That's okay. Look, we are at time. I'm really sorry. There's a chat happening inside the Q&A function of this webinar right now. I would encourage you to reach out to our panelists or to Liz if you want to continue this conversation, but I do believe passionately in getting people out on time, so I am going to call it time for today. I really want to thank Liz for putting together such a beautiful presentation and walking us through a really important and interesting piece of work, as well as Michaela and Simon for joining us and bringing your policy guru knowledge to the NDARC webinar this Thursday. Next week, we are lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Sun, who's going to talk to us about can we use AI to solve problems like youth vaping? So it's sure to be a good one as well. And we'll look forward to seeing you next Thursday, 3 o'clock. Thanks again. Have a nice afternoon.